Good evening. This is your host, Robert Maynard. Tonight, we're going to present to you the March edition of Operation City on the Hill. Tonight's show is going to be called Creation Spirituality, the Breastplate of St. Patrick. Now, the reason for this, obvious, is we're coming up on St. Patrick's Day, so I have an affinity for St. Patrick. My grandfather is Irish, and I like what he represents, what is something that's referred to as creation spirituality, which I want to go into a little bit. My original background was in science and engineering and mathematics, but there's a side of my hobby is in the rise and fall of civilizations in general. In particular, I'm interested in the cultural prerequisites of a free and prosperous society. Now, someone will ask, well, what does that have to do with creation spirituality? That's what I want to get into. Civilizations rest upon culture. The ideas and values that create a civilization come from its culture. And culture comes from the word cultivate, which has connotations in religion. If you look at the words, the Latin and Greek words from which it came from. In most religions, you have this image of a garden where you're cultivating something, and my wife is Japanese. I've been to Japan before. If you go to the Zen gardens, it's a really beautiful thing, but there's a philosophy of spirituality behind it. You're cultivating inner strength and inner beauty, but you're also cultivating, the beauty of the garden. You're trying to take wild things and you're trying to bring out the inner beauty in it. So it's not like exploiting it, but it's not just leaving it allowed to grow wild either. So you in the garden you cultivate it, you weed out the plants. In a bonsai tree you prune it and you let something beautiful is created out of it. So I would like to suggest that this theme of cultivation and this notion of a garden is very common in most religions. And my own religion, I came from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and religious equivalent being homeschooled. Her mother was part Iroquois Indian, so there was kind of a Native American spirituality, but her grandfather was Irishman, gypsy, kind of a druid. And but they were brought up in the study of the Bible, so they had these different, you had druid Irish Celtic spirituality, similar to the way St. Francis grew up in. You had the Native American Indian spirituality, which is something that is very creation spirituality. The spirituality of the process of creation plays a big role in Native Americans. So I wanted to, when I grew up, I'm going to go into the St. Patrick's part in this, but I want to explain where this notion came from, the notion of creation and spirituality. Is a term that is referred to the Genesis account, where you have this, there's two different accounts in the Hebrew Bible of what we refer to as Genesis, the act of creation. And there's, a lot of people argue over whether or not it should be taken literally, and I don't think it was meant to be literal. And they say, well, the earth weren't created in 6 days. We all know it took longer than that. Well, of course it took longer than that, and I don't think it was ever meant to be literal. There's a poetic metaphor going on. There's archetypical meaning to these stories, but I think people need to step back and what is being taught here. Up until the beginning of this creation story, the old nature worship tradition, and I've talked about this before, I want to talk about this again because this premise, I think, is key to a key insight to the whole notion of human freedom. What is the nature of human beings, and what is the rational justification for believing human beings should be free? And we live in a society now where it's assumed that we should be free. With freedom of speech, I have a right to this. But where did these premises come from? And this is something that I spent most of my life digging into, because my background is in science and engineering, but I'm very interested in the premises behind a free society. And prior to the advent of this Judeo-Christian creation narrative, the idea was that the cosmos was eternal. There was a divine eternal cosmos, and there was these forces, divine forces that rule the cosmos. You had the cycles of nature. You had generation and degeneration and regeneration, and birth and death and sickness and disease, and day and night and different seasons, cyclical nature. There is no room. The premises behind this is that everything that has happened will happen, and there's a cycle. Everything's in a cycle. You have birth and death, and there's no room for the notion of an act of free will. The idea that human beings could be a moral agent capable of an act of free will is unintelligible in this worldview. We are mere specks in this cosmic drama. Now, maybe that's true. I don't just dismiss it out of hand, but you got to think of the implications if it was true. B.F. Skinner, the famous behavioral psychologist, once said that if you're going to take, now the modern scientific, non-religious approach to human, we don't believe in this superstitious religion, we believe in scientific rationalism. Well, that is assuming that we are no different than the rest of nature. And B.F. Skinner once says, if you're going to take the scientific method and you're going to apply it to human society and human behavior, you have to assume that human beings are not free. So he was one of the few people who was admitting, if you're going to accept this notion of human behavior and where our nature comes from, then the idea of human freedom is unintelligible. So this is what is really at stake here when you're talking about the premises of human nature, in my opinion. Are we part of this vast cosmos, a mere speck in this cosmic drama? In that case, the ruling principles of reality, the dominant principles of reality is fatalism and determinism. And the notion of human free will is unintelligible. And if that was so, then the idea that we should be able to bestow rights upon one another doesn't make any more sense than telling the lion that the gazelle has rights. It's not intelligible. The idea that this is possible came from the notion that human beings are not just mere specks in this vast cosmic drama, but this actual cosmic drama started as an act of free will, as a creation. That's here, hence the title of this, Creation Spirituality. That the cosmos as we know it has a beginning and an end. And before the Big Bang Theory, scientists rejected the religious vision because they say, oh, we all know the cosmos is eternal. So it didn't come into being as an act of creation. But now at least many people believe that the cosmos had a beginning, or the universe as we know it had a beginning out of the Big Bang. So the question is, was this an intelligible act of free will, or was it not? The implications, metaphysical, I believe, metaphysical implications behind this are vast. Do you have happenstance, chance as the defining principle of reality, or a creative act of free will? Were human beings created in the image of this creator? Now, I don't believe in being preachy, and I don't like sectarianism. I grew up as, not part of an institutionalized religion, but I am very important. I think it's important that we make our free choices, but we recognize the implications behind those choices. And I have been one of the reasons why I wanted to make this discussion is because I've spent a lot of time online with friends talking in these chat groups, talking about the foundations of a free society. And someone's asked me, why do you believe the Genesis account is so important? Why can't we just go for atheism or agnosticism? And I says, well, of course you can go for anything you want because we have freedom of conscience. You have, the human mind is free, so you can believe what you want. But that's not the same thing as arguing that the premises behind those beliefs are equally supportive of the notion of a free society. I mean, we have the right to believe what we want, but we've got to think through the consequences. And I don't believe, my personal belief is that the creation spirituality notion gives the best set of premises for human freedom. And historically, that's where these notions of... So I want to talk about, in particular, the Genesis account a little bit before I go into St. Paul's Galatians and St. Patrick's breastplate story. In the Genesis account, you have these two accounts. One account that says God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them. So you have man meaning humankind, male and female. And so then in another account, you see this story of these creation. He's created birds and he's creating these. Then he creates Adam, which is one reading of that is the male of the species. Another reading of that, he's talking about the human species and get together. Male and female. So he starts out with the creation of Adam, and when he's creating the animals, he's creating them as a group. When he deals with the creation of Adam, of human beings, because I don't think he's talking about male and female personally, if you read the Hebrew, he's dealing with an individual, Adam, which means primordial human being, not necessarily the proper name of the male of the species. As we can. But anyway, I'm not going. Again, I'm not trying to preach, but I think there is a point being made here. Whether or not this is, I'm not referring to the historicity of this account, but I'm referring to there is archetypical story here, and point is being made here is this: the Creator is dealing one-on-one with a solitary individual. I've read accounts of what is referred to as original loneliness or original solitude. So the beginning of this stage of cultivation of creation spirituality is solitude or individuality. And so he brings the animals and different aspects of creation before Adam's, and he wants them to classify them. So that he names them, he starts naming them. In the process of classification, he recognizes that he didn't have a helpmate suitable for him. In other words, his own individuality or uniqueness was understood as part of this process of exploration, classification, science. Classification is part of being science. I think this gives you an image that science and spirituality are not two different things. Your exploration and your classification and your explanation of creation allows you to recognize your uniqueness as a human being. But also, the cultivation of a garden is scientific, but it's also bringing out beauty of creation. So it is not an exploitation. It is what is the term? There is a certain amount of responsibility that a gardener has over his garden, and is not exploiting it as something that violates that responsibility. So the idea that the Genesis account gives people free rein to exploit the resources that they've been entrusted to is not intelligible in this account. So you have science. A garden is the cultivation of beauty. Gardens also can be used for producing stuff for use or for selling. So that you got economic activity, you got environmental preservation, you got scientific behavior. This is all part of the recognition of the uniqueness of the human individual. And so this is part of a philosophy that former Pope John Paul, I'm not Catholic, but I like some of his writings, referred to as personalism, which talked about the dignity of the human person. So you have then you have Adam goes to sleep and he pulls his rib and he pulls the Eve out, and wow, now you have man and woman. Now, scientifically it doesn't make any sense, because biologically, in terms of DNA and the structure, the basic pattern is female, and male is a diversion from that. So the idea that female came out of male biologically doesn't make any sense. But and people have pointed this out, but what I think here is you're talking about Adam in the sense of human beings, and you're talking about the differentiation of human beings. And so the two became one flesh. So you're talking about an original solitude, original individuality, uniqueness in the first stage. The second stage, where Adam and Eve cohabit together and the two become one flesh, is original communion. We're not just individual beings, we're communal beings. And our individuality presupposes our communion, because from our individuality we recognize our uniqueness, which allows us to recognize that we're not whole. And the male and the female become two parts of the same whole. And so the compatibility, the cohabitability, and the collaboration between human beings is poetically expressed, I believe, in this account. And finally, they are naked, they are unashamed. Now, religion has this tendency some religions, and I think, to suppress sensuality. Sensuality, things like that are considered to be non-religious. But I'm going to go into that. That's in this view, they're talking about nakedness, which refers to sensuality. If you read John Milton's Paradise Lost, he talks about the role of sensuality and the power that it plays in the cultivation of these religious trek that you were on. And so the sensuality is like the rocket fuel that gives you the power for divination, spirit, the oneness with this godly being. You're created in the likeness and image and likeness of your Creator, and you're supposed to become God-like. So the question is, how do you do that? Well, there is a raw energy or force that allows you to do that if it's cultivated properly. Now, if it's not cultivated properly, it goes astray. It can be destructive. You look at rock and roll. It was a lot of high energy, and you had a lot of beautiful songs came out, but then eventually, in terms, you got sex, drugs, rock and roll, and the life expectancy of a lot of your people in Hollywood and your rock stars became very low. And that's sometimes the energy doesn't find a proper outlet, and it can become destructive to human striving. Just as destructive is trying to suppress it. So the ability to cultivate the passions, the raw eros, is a big part, I believe, in the garden of human potential. Now, I want to quickly, before we go into St. Patrick's birthplace, I want to refer to the book of Galatians, which is written by St. Paul. I want to refer to this because it is widely believed the book of Galatians, the Galatians were a Celtic people. And he's dealing with the Celtic people, Paul is, and he's right. At that time, you had the Celtic people were nature worshipers. In nature worship, you see the gods and these creative forces are within nature, and so he talks to them about being slaves to elemental forces of the universe. In other words, you have no free will. There are forces beyond your control, and they worship these forces, and the forces may be good or may be bad, they may be malevolent or benevolent, but they have to be placated. And what this approach is trying to say, no, that the incarnation of Christ frees you from these things, that the forces of nature are the incarnation of a transcendent force of good. Now I want to pull up St. Patrick's breastplate, which is going to deal with St. Patrick's take up on the same theme. Cue that up.
The breastplate of St. Patrick.
I bind to myself today the strong virtue of the invocation of the Trinity. I believe the Trinity in the unity, the Creator of the universe.
I bind to myself today the virtue of the incarnation of Christ with his baptism, the virtue of his crucifixion with his burial, the virtue of his resurrection with his ascension, the virtue of his coming on the judgment day.
I bind to myself today the virtue of the love of seraphim, in obedience of angels, in the hope of resurrection unto reward, in prayers of patriarchs, in predictions of prophets, in preaching of apostles, in faith of confessors, in purity of holy virgins, in deeds of righteous men.
I bind to myself today the power of heaven, the light of the sun, the brightness of the moon, the splendor of fire, the flashing of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of sea, the stability of earth, the compactness of rocks.
I bind to myself today God's power to guide me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to teach me, God's eye to watch over me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to give me speech, God's hand to guide me, God's way to lie before me, God's shield to shelter me, God's host to secure me against the snares of demons, against the seductions of vices, against the lusts of nature, against everyone who mediates injury to me, whether far or near, whether few or with many.
I invoke today all these virtues against every hostile, merciless power which may assail my body and my soul, against the incantations of false prophets, against the black laws of heathenism, against the false laws of heresy, against the deceits of idolatry, against the spells of witches and smiths and druids, against every knowledge that binds the soul of man. Christ, protect me today against every poison, against burning, against drowning, against death wound, that I may receive abundant reward.
Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ within me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ at my right, Christ at my left, Christ in the fort, Christ in the chariot seat, Christ on the deck, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks to me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me.
I bind to myself today the strong virtue of an invocation of the Trinity. I believe the Trinity in the unity, the Creator of the universe. Amen.
Okay, yes. So that today that might seem unintelligible to us unless we understand the context in which it, because the belief in the spirits, they worship the spirits, the spirits of nature. You have the moon and the sun, and you have the seasons, and you have these different spirits of nature, which may be benevolent or malevolent. And so you have these shamans or druids, and they could do good for you on your behalf, or do bad to you. And so you had spell casting, you had all these things that the breastplate is like a shield. It's protecting you from these things. And basically he's talking with the people who are obsessed with their fears of incarnations and incantations. And basically he's arguing there is a shield, you don't have to be afraid of these kind of things. So in one sense, it makes for an ethnic of creationism, because the forces are no longer seen as malevolent, or the fear of the forces of nature. We have this vision of ancient man living wonderfully in harmony with nature. To a certain extent, that's partially true, but a lot of extent, when you live directly in harmony with nature, you're living with death at your doorstep all the time, and it is a real struggle, life and death struggle. So it's not as romantic as we tend to picture it sometimes in the modern view. And so the life and death struggle is seen as a struggle between spiritual forces and spiritual reality. And this argument is being made that there's nothing there really to fear, because the ultimate reality is benevolent, not malevolent. And so this contrast between the malevolent forces and benevolent forces, and this warring that's going on, is superseded with this benevolence. And this benevolence is incarnated into the creation. That's what he's taught, his understanding. St. Patrick deals with this idea of the presence of God incarnated in creation. Now, the premise behind that gives rise to a view that sees creation and sees the environment as something that is holy, and something that is a expression of this holy force. So the idea that you have benevolent forces versus there's probably some truth to. He's obviously not being naive. You got life and death. You got these forces going on, but the ultimate real force is a force of life, and a force of. And so this idea of the permanent battle between good and evil, that there is no eventual victory for the forces of good, or that evil is just as prominent as good, he rejected that, because the ultimate power behind creation is this force that is good. So therefore we can enter into a relationship with the rest of nature that is not adversarial. And so we can have scientific exploration of the creation, and a cultivation of the creation, and a cultivation of our own individuality. These things are not in conflict. And we're coming up on spring, where you're going to have. I'm an environmentalist in one sense, but in another sense, there is an anti-humanistic approach to certain movements within the environment. Well, we're going to destroy the. Well, yes, we've done a lot of bad things to the environment, but you think about, we have the ability to cultivate it. A water treatment system, certainly treating water is a lot better than drinking water out of a swamp. So you want to be able to have the ability to bring out the best in creation without exploiting it. So I think human creativity, technology, and science can, in the care for the poor through economic development and environmental preservation, is a spiritual reality that flows from the premises of creation spirituality. If I had more time, I'd go into it, but I don't have more time. So we'll deal with this topic again later. Thank you very much, and have a nice night.